Is there a price to pay for success? Who gets to tell the stories we hear? And is ambition a dirty word? Welcome to Q&A. We're going to get to your questions on the international response to Afghanistan, separating the art from the artist, and the influence of political leaders past and present. Now, here to give you some answers, Emmy Award-winning actor Brian Cox, who's in Australia for the Melbourne Writers' Festival and Antidote in Sydney. Artistic director of short black opera Deborah Cheetham. Singer-songwriter Marlon Williams, who will also be performing a little later on. Author and veterans advisor McGregor, and photojournalist and author Andrew Quilty. Please make them all feel welcome. As always, you can live stream us around the country on iView, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Quandra is the hashtag, so please get involved. Let's get started tonight. Our first question comes from Helen van der Nagel.
They say that to get to the top, one needs to do 10,000 hours of practice, have great genetics, share ideas, work hard and ensure that you've got good people surrounding you. But does luck play a part, and has luck played a part for you? Ooh,
Marlon, lucky?
Absolutely lucky, yeah. I'm lucky to have been given whatever genes I've got to that allow me to be able to do my job. I'm lucky to have had a really supportive, artistically minded upbringing. I'm lucky to have a country that by and large supports and commits itself to artistic endeavours, and more broadly to live in a world that values what I do.
And the 10,000 hours wouldn't hurt either, I'd imagine.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I'm there yet, but yeah.
Deborah, having good people around you, how important has that been on your journey?
So important. I'm so fortunate that I benefited from an education, a music education in particular, that was driven by an individual. She's still a great friend to this day, Jennifer King, a lifelong friend, someone who saw in me an ability that she wanted to foster, nurture.
And did you see that?
Well,
or was it someone saying, you've got this?
Do you know what? I didn't separate it out from the rest of my life. Music was just everywhere. It was the fabric of my life. I mean, it's in our DNA, right? It's our way of knowing and being. But Jennifer saw that and she went above and beyond. It just wasn't in the classroom. It was countless concerts and operas and opportunities to immerse myself in the craft that I've made my life. So I feel really fortunate for that. I don't know whether I call it luck, but I do feel very fortunate to have had that education.
Brian, it's also, I could imagine, a very selfish endeavour, is it? You've got to be able to dedicate yourself to something, and it must come at a cost.
Yeah, I don't know what the cost is. I'm still working it out. I think that I agree with actually both what Marlon and Deborah has said, that the good people are the most important factor, are those who help you on the way, you know. And I've been very, very lucky in the people right from school that helped me form, who could see more than what I could see at times. My schooling was a disaster, but I had two guys. A guy called George Hackett, who actually was emigrated here. Sadly, he's no longer with us, so he was my registrar, and another guy called Bill Dewar. And they helped me get my first step, and then everything led accordingly. So, and I consider myself incredibly lucky.
Did you, is there planning, or is this something that you're into it and it takes you and you say yes to this, yes to this, yes to this, and you just keep on going?
Yeah, my wife would agree. I just never say no. That's the problem. I should learn how to say no more often than I do, and I don't. And yeah, I think saying yes to this is the best answer, because then you find out by yes if it's wrong or not. But, otherwise you don't know. You live in a kind of ignorance, really.
And acting, of course, you want to say yes because you don't know.
Well, exactly. You've got to keep working,
Andrew, in your own work, as a photojournalist, there's enormous sacrifice, isn't there, and an enormous toll that this takes on you as well, to dedicate yourself to something. Do you think about that? Was it something you were conscious of while you were pursuing your career?
That's something I often hear and an assumption that a lot of people have, but it never felt like I was sacrificing anything over the 10 years or so that I was living in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Not once did I feel I was sacrificing anything. I was a freelance photojournalist. I could have been based anywhere in the world. It just so happened that I chose to live predominantly in Kabul because that's where my passion was most satiated.
And in terms of all the things we were hearing tonight, the luck or having good people around you, what is it that separates your career, from others, to put yourself into extraordinary situations, to take yourself out of your comfort zone as well? What is it that leads you to do that? Probably,
like Brian said, I think I'm still working that out. And I very much, I'm not someone who makes plans. I guess I said yes at one particular time that led me to Afghanistan initially, and then I got hooked on the place and found purpose in my work, and just followed that.
And Catherine, purpose, that's a word, and I think everyone here would agree in some way that it's finding that thing, isn't it?
Yeah. And if I'm ever successful, I'll get back to you about what it looks and feels like. But I with Andrew, I never had a plan. In one sense, I achieved an ambition that I had from that high. I wanted to be an Australian soldier, and I was by the age of 17. And I walked away from that and then re-enlisted in the army the day after the 9/11 attacks. And that was never in the script. I thought I'd closed that door. It surprised me, and I stayed 20 years. But certainly purpose was a central part of that, for sure.
Plenty to get to tonight. Let's hear now from Ros West.
What is the role of artists and celebrities in raising issues of public importance? What part do you want to play in telling stories to raise particular issues? Do celebrity opinions carry more weight with decision makers than those of the average citizen?
Brian.
I think you've always got to be contentious. I think that's the most important thing, and you really have to stand up for yourself politically. We get a bad reputation, actors. They say, how dare actors speak about certain things that we're not supposed to understand. But then our bloody job is about understanding that. If we're playing somebody, we've got to understand. I played a lot of parts, actually. I played Herman Goring. I played an Iron Bevan. And you couldn't get two more separate people than Herman Goring and an Iron Bevan who created the National Health Service, and Herman Goring, who created Adolf Hitler. So you can't get anything more extraordinary than that. And therefore, you have to inhabit that. And by inhabiting it, you understand what the process is. You understand what it's about. And that's why you form, and it's through that you form political opinion. And political opinion is important. I've gone through all kinds of changes politically. I was a great socialist. I did the Voice of Labour in the UK in 1997. I helped get Tony Blair elected.
Then you realised Labour wasn't socialist.
Well, Labour was not at all socialist. And social democracy was failing, particularly at the time of Iraq. And what Blair did in Iraq was disgraceful. The act of hubris was ridiculous. And I decided, where do I go now? Where is social democracy alive and well? And ironically, it was back in my home country of Scotland. There's an amazing woman called Nicola Sturgeon, who I think is an extraordinary person. And she's leading the country. The First Minister right now, yeah. Yeah, and she's the First Minister. And hopefully we're going to go for another referendum. They'll try and stop us, but the heart of the people wants to be free. Yeah. Like you Australians have got the big debate about monarchy, and I wish you good luck with it. But I think it's important that you stand up for your beliefs. Otherwise, you know, what is it about? You know, what is life about? But how we live.
Deborah, you can applaud if you want. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Deborah, you've done that. You refused to sing the Australian anthem when you were invited in 2015, right, for the AFL Grand Final?
Yeah.
Because of many things, I suspect, but because of the wording that we are young and free.
Yeah.
That's changed to one and free. Does that make a difference to you? Would you sing it now?
That was a dreadful change. No consultation. Change one word. What does that do? You know, just this week we honoured a great Australian, just a couple of nights ago, Judith Durham.
Yeah.
And Judith Durham wrote a new lyric for our anthem in 2009. I helped to launch it actually at the Victorian College of the Arts, and it was beautiful. It acknowledged everyone. It acknowledged the achievements that we've made as Australians. I mean, our anthem was written in the 1800s by a Scot as a white Australia policy anthem, really. And if you look at all the other verses, they're terrible. But yeah, look, I took a stand that year. I was invited to sing the national anthem, and I just felt I couldn't anymore. I had for many years. I couldn't. So I went back to the AFL and I said, I'd be happy to sing it if I can sing Judith's lyrics. Mm-hmm. Australians, let us stand as one upon this ancient land. You know, that's all of our inheritance, and yet we're still so far away from understanding that that's something we can share. It's not just mine as an Indigenous, as a Yorta Yorta woman. That's all of our inheritance, but it really depends on how much we understand that connection. We've got to go on that journey from perhaps not even knowing about it to knowing about it and then understanding it. And I would say, I would separate artists out from celebrities. I think that there are some artists who achieve celebrity, but they probably don't enjoy it that much. So I'd separate those two things out, and I think that's actually our remit as artists, because the arts are a way of knowing and being in the world. They're a millennia old. They're central to the way we exist, the way society holds together. So I think that it's actually our duty of care as artists to society.
Marlon, as a performer, as a musician, do you see your role as political as well, and are you comfortable with a political voice as well as a musical one?
I've never been overtly political as a songwriter, but it's implicit. It's implicit in everything you do. You know, you're calling out to society and presenting a story that exists within the framework of politics, and I think it's foolish to think that you can somehow, in any aspect of life, in terms of arts and in terms of anything, it's foolish to think you're somehow outside of the realm, you know. And to go to that point about celebrity does carry weight with you know, in the public square, and so it, you know, just by virtue of the loudness of the voice, you know, and the reach. So, and that's both that's potentially a dangerous thing. And so, but the artist side is, yeah, it is. There's a duty to engage and to be unafraid of exploring and following your nose of wherever that takes you, I think. And so that's, yeah, it's inherently political.
Let's hear from Eve Constantine.
Hi, how are you? My question was predominantly directed to Marlon, but I wanted to ask how you approach storytelling when you sit down to write music, and whether or not you use your discernment in regards to what stories you think are deserving of being told.
I'm one of those artists who is, you know, waits for the divine inspiration, so to speak. I'm very unstructured in the way I write. I don't mull over something that's happening in the world and try and get out my anguish in a very direct way. I hear something that takes my interest, and then just follow my nose, really, and I can be surprised and appalled or dismayed at where the character sometimes wants to go, you know. But I'm okay with that and with that process. And you know, obviously, when you're presenting things, you've got to think about what it is you're presenting. But that is all part of the same process. Yeah.
How do you bottle that? How do you capture it? Because I'd imagine if you're waiting for that inspiration to come, it could come at any time.
Oh, it's my iPhone.
The most inconvenient times.
Yeah, iPhone's pretty good at capturing things like that.
If you can bottle it.
But Brian, you mentioned before that the roles you play. You mentioned Hermann Goering. You were the one who brought Hannibal Lecter to the screen before Sir Anthony Hopkins, of course, in Mindhunter.
Manhunter.
Manhunter.
There's also Mindhunter.
It certainly was. The role you play now in Succession, you played Shakespearean roles as well. What do you look for? I'm probably interested really in what you look for in the dark character to bring that to life and make that character human in some way, relatable in some way.
Well, I think everybody's human. Faults and all, warts and all. I mean, you know...
Must be hard with a Goering character.
Well, it is hard, but if you look at a child, you look at a little baby, you know, like this, I hate this notion of original sin. You know, the idea that children have, clearly they don't have original sin. They're a kind of open map, ready to be imprinted upon. And some kids are imprinted upon rather badly, and some kids are imprinted upon rather well. And what happens is how that child develops into a person. So you see someone like Hermann Goring, and then when you examine somebody like Goring, you see the reasons why he did what he did. And they're very complicated, too complicated to spend time now. And equally with an Aaron Bevan as a balance. Now, somebody like Logan Roy, Logan is essentially a misanthrope, and essentially he is, a little bit like myself, disappointed with the human experiment.
Yeah.
You know, the human experiment has probably never been as bad as it is at this precise moment. What's happening?
And disappointed in his children.
And well, he's disappointed in his children. But the thing about it is, he loves his children.
And that's what you had to find,
That's his Achilles heel.
Right.
Is the love of his children. So that humanizes him in a way, and that keeps him human. But at the same time, he is quite ruthless, he is quite determined, and he's self-made. You know, everybody compares him to Rupert Murdoch, but Rupert Murdoch wasn't self-made. You know, Logan Roy is self-made, and that makes a huge difference, because there are choices you make along the path that's not already been preordained for you. And I see him as someone who he was a journalist, and he became a disappointed journalist. So you create a backstory to come to this point of ruthlessness, which he has.
A disappointed journalist, God forbid. Catherine, you've been in many different roles. You mentioned the army, you've been a writer, a script writer. What is the creative process in writing for someone else? Hearing their voice, but how much of that is you as well, speaking through the person you're writing for?
I think what Theodore Sorensen said about those magnificent
JFK.
speeches he wrote for Kennedy, that they were all President Kennedy's speeches, and I think that's the unstated pact of any speechwriter. It's not the speechwriter's speech. And there's some kind of a quirk of being able to capture someone's voice. I love the written and spoken word, and during some of these last couple of years that have been a bit strange, we're a lot of time in isolation. There are some cadences that I love. There's the eulogy Bill Clinton delivered at Yitzhak Rabin's funeral. Beautiful speech, beautifully cadenced, quoted from the Old and New Testaments, and wove a story through it. I listened to a speech by Kennedy, a tribute to Robert Frost, the poet. Those sort of cadences I find then somehow migrate into my pen. It's not plagiarism as such, but somehow I think you channel that stuff. And I've been happiest in the last few years where I've just written as myself, written some, and there's a cadence in the spoken word. I'm sure the actors and the singers know that, but a good speech and even a well-delivered, well-crafted address, even in a forum such as this, if it's cadenced correctly, and yeah, there's an art to it, undoubtedly, and capturing someone's voice. Bob Carr I loved writing for. There was
With a
dynamic,
sonorous voice and a great performing aspect
very
as well.
mellifluous, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Here's a question from Jean Lee.
The pen is mightier than the sword, indicating that the written word is more effective than violence as a tool for communicating a point. But why do so many still choose to use violence, such as war, to resolve their disagreements?
Andrew.
Oof. Well, it's a very good question, and I don't think I have an answer for it. If I did, I'd probably be getting paid more than I am as a journalist. But I think it's an easy way to act upon an emotion, to act out anger. In the case of the war in Afghanistan, I think one of the first mistakes was going in as quickly as we did. Although it was a so-called legal war, it was sanctioned by the UN Security Council. I think the basis for the original invasion was too heavily predicated upon revenge, and that means that any diplomacy that could have taken effect before then wasn't given a chance. Any learning about the country and the culture and the people and the foe was not given a chance to occur, and the results speak for themselves now.
When you look at your work, I know we're talking about words here, but you've written a book about your experience, but the power of your images as well, which often speak, as we know, more loudly than words. Did you feel as if that was getting through, as if that was a way of connecting through the violence or revealing something about the conflict?
I'd like to think that what I was able to convey in Afghanistan that was different from a lot of the photographers who'd been in Afghanistan before me and photographed the war itself, the conflict, the combat, was to show a side of Afghanistan, the side of Afghanistan that wasn't at war. The faces of people who were living alongside the conflict, living on the front lines, but who weren't themselves taking part in the conflict. I think that seems to be what resonated for those who appreciated my pictures anyway.
Catherine?
I disagree with Andrew on a point here. I think the initial military action against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was legitimate. It was an extraordinary, not only the Security Council, I think the General Assembly, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, Pakistan and China, endorsed that action. There was an enormous degree of unanimity. The first global leader to call Bush after the attacks on the towers was Vladimir Putin. So if you look back to that world on that day, the degree of repugnance at those attacks, and Andrew is much more steeped in life in Afghanistan, and I defer to that. I don't think the Taliban were ever going to hand over AQ, and nor that I don't think it gave them any joy to accommodate them after they'd seen what he'd done either. My problem wasn't the initial strike, and I wrote it while I was inside the army, and I sponsored works by people who took this view. I don't think we should have ever gone back for the nation-building phase. I think at the Bonn conference, and Karzai was the wrong leader, I agree, that we're mirror imaging ourselves there with an urbane, corrupt individual. He was the wrong leader for Afghanistan after the Taliban were deposed. But I don't think, looking at the evidence of the Russian war there, the Soviet war there, that nation building in that society was ever going to avail us. The surgical strike, removal of the training camps, driving AQ out of, and then they could have maintained surveillance using remotely piloted systems and local forces operating with special forces. You did not need to have the footprint we had there after 2006-07. It was a terrible mistake.
Brian, and then came Iraq, and of course you've mentioned that was part of your split with Labor. If there was a case, and certainly at the UN and after the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, there was support for the initial invasion of Afghanistan. Iraq was a different thing, wasn't it?
Well, it's all linked. I think what we've never understood, what Lawrence tried to do, Lawrence Arabia, and even goes back further. There's a wonderful book by James Morris, now sadly no longer with us, called Jan Morris, and he wrote the Pax Britannica, which was the story of the British first connection with Afghanistan and imperialism, and all of this.
The graveyard of empires.
That's right, and it is the graveyard of empires. It goes right back to trying to alter a society. When a society doesn't need altering, it needs recognizing. And that's the problem that's been right from the start. So it's a knock-on effect. So the Russian war in Afghanistan, it's all been very pointless because the fundamental root of it has never been examined. You know, this is a culture that we don't always understand, and we try to change it, we try to shift it, we try to make it, we try to rationalize it in our own terms. And I think we have to begin to understand how cultures evolve. And it's, I mean, what we did in the Middle East was dreadful. And what we did now, what Blair did and what Bush did and Cheney particularly and Donald Rumsfeld did in Iraq was horrendous because it disturbed a balance that had been created. You know, the balance between the Sunni and the Shia. And for all his horribleness, what's his name, Saddam, understood that. But also, as with all leaders, and certainly as you mentioned about the Prime Minister there is always this element of corruption. And it's the corruption that comes to the fore. And that's the tragedy of putting yourself in a position.
Coming back to the question, if I may, for a moment, though.
The pen is mightier than sword, or not.
I'd like to address that. And just as to leaving aside concepts of original sin, there's a wonderful study by a historian, Azar Gatt, who's written an anthropological survey. It's a work of great scope. We've been fighting since we were painting in caves. I don't know why. It's dispiriting, and when you talk about, as a species, are we at a point where it's bleaker than ever? I don't think the Bard would agree with you on that.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned the Bard, because of course, wasn't it in Hamlet that many wearing rapiers are afraid of those with goose quills?
And also Fortinbras, when he sees they're going to fight over a piece of land that's, you know, nothing. And Hamlet can't understand what this extraordinary soldier is doing. And of course, it's one of the central debates in his life. You know.
We have but 1/10,000 of those men in England who do no work this day.
Yeah.
Deborah, it's interesting, of course, we reflect on the Australian experience, and we're still dealing with 200 plus years of colonisation and invasion and conflict in our own land. If we're talking about the pen being mightier than the sword, what does something like a voice to Parliament, which we'll be voting on in the term of this government, deliver in terms of being able to tell the truth about history?
Yeah,
is it strong enough?
I think we have to recognise that not everybody gets a pen.
That's right.
And that's the problem, you know, and without education on how to be a society, a cohesive society, without those lessons of empathy that should spring from our humanity, and they don't. Those people who are disenfranchised because they don't have a pen will turn to the sword or be manipulated to turn to the sword. So, bring it back to... So I just wanted to say there that I think the pen is mightier than the sword, but not everybody gets one. And we have to make sure that everybody gets one. Yeah? But this point about colonisation and our journey and our voice to Parliament, look, I'm going to say it right now. This is going to be my third referendum, right? 67. Can we count you as a human being and not a plant or an animal? That was the first referendum. Marriage equality, right? Second referendum, yeah? I'm engaged to be married now. My fiancé is here, and I'm telling you, what we went through to get to that point where love is love, that was punishing. And what was it, 67.8? Got us across the line. In Aotearoa, they sang, Pokari Kariana, I wept on that day when I watched Parliament. We got it across the line, and I wanted to celebrate more, and now this third referendum. Okay, that's what we're going to do. But I really ask you, should I live through another referendum to tell me that I can have a voice to Parliament? My ancestors have poured their knowledge into this land for 2,000, generations. I'm tired of the referendums, and there may be another one on the monarchy eventually. That's another conversation for another time, but we've got to have that voice. If it's to be representational and that belonging I was talking about, that inheritance that we should all feel as Australians, really it's essential that there are first Australians in Parliament. And I'm glad to see there's a movement behind that. I just wish we didn't have to go through another referendum.
Marlon, is the pen mightier than the sword?
Well, I'm with Deborah. We both Aboriginal and Māori culture are both they're oral cultures. There's no pens in either culture.
Right.
So, and when the New Zealand land wars were taking place, violence broke down between the Crown they couldn't impose their will. There was parity of population. There was just a massive resistance for Māori, and so they had to turn to the pen instead of the sword. And that's
the Treaty of Waitangi.
Yeah, yep, the Treaty of Waitangi. Well, after that, that they failed to uphold their obligations to the treaty, and then the land wars broke out, and when they broke down, sweeping confiscations and running everything through the native land court, putting everything through the courts, where it was expensive. It was there's the power of the law came in, which is another word for the pen, really, came in and took over. Yeah.
As a Māori performer, do you feel the weight of that too when you perform, and do you feel the privilege as well of the representation of Māori people?
I do. It's a responsibility, and I'm very humbled by it, but I'm very open and honestly curious about my own personal journey through being Māori and what it means to me, and it always has to be, as an artist, it always has to be inward outward, I think, and that does come in conflict sometimes when you're representative of seem to be representing a culture, because no one can do that fully. No single person can do that.
So true.
So I have a responsibility to myself first as an artist, and then as a Māori, and then on out.
If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A live with Brian Cox, Deborah Cheetham, Marlon Williams, Catherine McGregor and Andrew Quilty. Well, just over a year ago, images of men, women and children desperately trying to flee Kabul as the Taliban took over shocked the world. Here in Australia, the Afghan community watched on as hard-fought rights for many were unwound. Now, one of them was Sanam Wahidi. Let's hear from her now.
Hi. From your experience on the ground, Andrew, do you think that the international community is adequately responding to the plight in Afghanistan, more specifically on the issue of women?
Thanks for your question, Sanam. First of all, I should state that I haven't been in Afghanistan since May, so I don't have the up-to-date experience there, but for the experience I had before then, look, the international community is in a very difficult position where, they've backed themselves into a corner, really, where they, their mission, their military mission ultimately failed, bringing back the Taliban that they ousted 20 years ago. But they have, first of all, they have a lot of blood on their hands, the international community. They also have a lot of a big moral responsibility to continue to be involved in and support the people that they went to, quote unquote, save. And for now, no, I don't think they're doing enough. I think the fact that the Biden administration is talking about giving half of Afghanistan's national assets to victims of the 9/11 attacks is, it's not his money to make that decision, for one. However, again, I don't really have an answer other than that they can't, the international community cannot look away. They have a huge moral obligation, and it's increasingly difficult to put pressure on the international community because there are less journalists there. There's less international attention because there's more focus on China and Ukraine now. I think that Ukraine was a gift for the Taliban, who, after all this upsurge of international interest, was swept away earlier this year. And they now have a lot of, more impunity than they did before things kicked off in Ukraine.
Andrew, I'm wondering too, we're learning still more about this 2 decades-long conflict, and we've had the Brereton report into war crimes there as well. When you reflect on your experience there, and you talk about having blood on our hands, people who, of course, went in there to oust the Taliban and to root out Al-Qaeda. When you reflect on that war and the enormity of it and the entirety of it, what do you walk away feeling?
I think the end result of a return to the Taliban was an inevitability of our own making, which was made to a large extent by the wrongs of individuals within the Australian military, the American military, and the international military at large, and the Afghan government, whose armed forces, who were trained in the model of international forces, particularly by the Americans, with techniques that undermined the greater mission and the nation-building mission, and essentially rebuilt the Taliban. The Taliban, and that they've told this to me, that the international military forces were their greatest recruiting tool, and you see that time and again. And the Brereton report, although it does not reflect the Australian Defence Force's footprint and legacy in its entirety, the bad apples among them caused immeasurable damage.
How important is it, Catherine, that there is follow-through with that? I remember Linda Reynolds at the time, the Defence Minister, saying she felt ill reading that report. Andrew says it doesn't reflect the entirety of the Australian military presence, but it is a stain. What happens now?
Well, can I just ask one question? What are you proposing the international community do? Return in a military footprint to ensure that women enjoy the rights they had before August last year? Because that strikes me as being absolutely not viable and impossible. And my recollection is that the Russian invasion was sparked by an uprising in Herat when the local puppet administration sent girls to school without veils. So I think we've learned a fairly long lesson in foreign engagement in Afghanistan that we can't impose Western mores there, and Andrew's said as much in terms of... It
goes back to what Brian was saying earlier.
I agree, and I'm very cautious about re-engaging, and I have friends in the veteran community who are taking steps to help people get out where they wish to be, to get out from under the Taliban regime, and those efforts are going on sometimes quite anonymously. Taking the other point, I'm far too close to all of this process out of the Brereton inquiry. It ended my military service because a very former senior officer approached me the Friday before that was published and divulged certain matters to me, and I had to recuse myself from the ADF chain of command after I heard what I heard.
Why was that?
Because he had made allegations about numerous officers who held senior appointments in that chain of command, and I couldn't serve on with any integrity, so I notified my superiors and I handed in my access to the remote computer system, and I called the Minister for Defence at that time, and I spoke also to Andrew Hastie, who was a coalition backbencher and veteran from the Special Air Service, and told them both what I had heard. And I can't unhear it. But I would also add that over the course of this journey, I've waxed and waned as to the process that those men have been subjected to, because the net was cast very, very wide in that inquiry, and some extraordinary coercion was applied to people who have been told now that they're no longer of any interest to the inquiry. The notices on most of them have been lifted, and from the best I can glean, and I know personally Soldier A and Soldier C, as they were called in the Four Corners program, I know precisely their version of those events and what happened in their interrogations by the IGADF. In my view, and people need to remember this, if there are any indictments issued as a result of this process, and all of them are interrogated without any defence against self-incrimination, with the most rudimentary provision of junior reserve officer counsel while they were being interrogated by a judicial figure who was also a two-star general. No protection against self-incrimination. At the end of this process, if anyone is charged, they will be charged on Commonwealth indictments. And Section 80 of our Constitution guarantees trial by jury. I would think after the BRS defamation trial, after the 98 days of hearings, that was a judge sitting alone.
Ben Roberts-Smith, of course.
Ben Roberts-Smith. It is impossible to impanel a jury that has a view on these matters.
I'll just get a quick response from that from Andrew before we move on. What do you want to see in terms of a follow-up to the Brereton report?
Well, I think proper follow-up is occurring through the Office of the Special Investigator, which I do have confidence in, and I know they have impanelled a very capable organisation, and I am quietly optimistic. But I think something that those who rail against the Brereton report and further prosecutions fail to recognise is that the allegations that have been made, and mark my word, the Brereton report is the tip of the iceberg. I spent some time in Uruzgan, where Australian forces were based, in April last year, and I myself, as an individual, having spent a week there, found more cases than the Brereton report unveiled. I think what has to be remembered is that what's at stake is the legacy of not only the legacy of the ADF, which has been tarred thanks to the actions of a few individuals. If justice needs to be served not only for the perpetrators but also for the victims, as well as the members of the ADF who did nothing wrong. The other thing is that the actions that incurred these allegations, they go against our national self-interest. I mean, they undermine the entire international military mission in Afghanistan.
Salam, can I just go back to you? What's it been like for you to watch from afar as the Taliban returns and you still have family in Afghanistan?
Yes, I think a lot of the time when Western media portrays the plight of Afghanistan, they fail to humanise Afghans and their stories. And it was a very difficult time for my community, seeing what was happening to our family, people associated with ADF forces, coalition forces, international aid organisations was very difficult for us all, and it's still something that we struggle to deal with. And for my family here, reinvigorated a lot of that post-traumatic stress.
And your family, you're in contact with your family at the moment in Afghanistan. How are they faring?
It's the situation, it only gets worse day by day. It's conflated with economic issues, famine, poverty, on top of the political violence that is happening.
And this after 20 years of war, well, for Afghanistan, 40 years of war, going back to the Soviet invasion in 1979. I hope your family is doing okay, and I hope you're able to stay in regular touch with them. Thank you, Sanam.
Thank you.
I want to move on to our next question now, and it comes from Jimmy Fong. Jimmy?
Deborah, while I believe language is a form of identity, and I believe in the importance of upholding it, when it comes to sharing it to the vast majority who don't speak Indigenous language, how is that message going to transpire? Shouldn't your art be more focused on telling your stories in a more universal language?
I think our Indigenous languages are the universal languages. They're the oldest in the world. They have the longest continuing culture. And I would say that the process that I undertake is to make sure that any language I'm writing in, so my own language, Yorta Yorta language, that is made accessible to the Yorta Yorta people, and in particular the Yorta Yorta children. It's really important that communities learn to be conversant in their own languages before they hear it out there in the general public. So every program that I have, it instilled in that is that the community from which the language comes will have access. That's really fundamental. I did a big project with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. A couple of years ago, they decided that they wanted to do an acknowledgement of country at every single performance. I'm sure many of you have heard this acknowledgement of country, but not only in the language of the Bunwarang people, but in the language of all 9 nations on which the MSO perform. And part of the agreement in writing this piece of music and setting it to all those languages was that that would be gifted back to community so that they could learn their language. Now, I think that English is a fine language, and where would we be this evening or on any other occasion if we couldn't express ourselves in a nuanced way? What I'm fighting for is what my great-grandmother lost through the brutality of early colonisation, where her identity was taken from her, her land was taken from her. Language is formed from the geography in which it resides. So there's a very strong connection between the dispossession of land and language and the suppression of identity. So we need to bring this back. And nothing gives me more pleasure than being able to speak in a language. This evening, when Brian and I were backstage, I wanted to give acknowledgement of country because Brian and Nicole had just arrived in Australia here on the Kulin Nations, and I wanted them both to hear the language that is still in this land. And I think it's going to be a great gift for us all if we can say to guests visiting us, Wominjeka. I mean, we should all say that right now. Let's say it, Wominjeka.
Wominjeka.
Wominjeka. Or if you're on the other side of the river, Wominjeka, because we've got accents, you know. But it means...
That does lead to confusion, though.
Well, it can. Like,
this is from a Scot, mind you, talking about accents that lead to confusion.
Did you say castle or castle? I mean, let's not go there. But what Wominjeka means, or Wominjeka, Auntie Carolyn Briggs, Nawit Carolyn Briggs, taught us that it means come, state your intention, and I'll escort you through country. It's really nuanced, and I think it's something that empowers us as Australians. I know when I sing in a traditional language on the country that it comes from, if I'm up on Yorta Yorta country, down on Gunditjmara country, right here on Bunwarang, Wurundjeri country, I feel so empowered when I'm speaking that language. So I think they are the original universal languages, and we all just need to get on board.
Brian, what did it feel like to be welcomed tonight when you arrived here in those languages?
Well, privileged, really, and honoured, because it's the fundament of what this land was.
And of course, where you come from as well, there has been a struggle throughout Great Britain for people's languages to be spoken.
Absolutely.
Gaelic languages, Welsh languages, Scottish languages to be spoken.
Yeah, it's always been a tricky thing. I mean, I had to speak Gaelic in a film. I don't speak Gaelic. And it's the hardest language in the world because it bears no relationship to English whatsoever. So that makes it doubly difficult to understand and doubly difficult to kind of adhere to, because I've been brought up speaking English or Scots English, you know, accented. Well, mind you, where I come from, for instance, I'll give you an example. If you say, I've eaten everything, where I come from, you would say,
There you go. Hello.
That's great.
That's what it would be, but that's just lazy Dundonian speak. That's nothing sophisticated.
Do you fall back into that when you go back home? That's the way you speak?
I slip back into the accent. Well, I slip into the accent very easily when I go back home. I used to try and resist it. I have a nephew who's lived here for 40 years, and he still hasn't lost his Dundonian accent.
As a performer, you've performed with different accents. How do you do that, and what do you find in that to be authentic as well? It's the first thing people spot. We hear an American playing an Australian, and we hear them say "g'day." We know how that sounds, isn't it?
Well, I would be embarrassed. I tried to do an Australian. Well, I do an Australian accent to my wife, and then I did it the other day on the radio,
to do it for us
and it
now.
was terrible.
You've got to do it for us now.
No, I'm not going to do it again. No, I've done it once. I'm not going to put my head in that particular lion's mouth, quite frankly.
But how do you find that when you're performing?
Well, you do. You know, you learn it. I had to play. I'm too short, but I played LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, and he spoke in a South Texas accent. So I had somebody instructing me. I had a teacher who taught me like a piece of music. So you learn it like learning a piece of music, and then you assimilate it, and it's repetition, repetition, repetition. You repeat, and you get the whole thing in you.
Do you stay in it when you're performing, when you're offset?
No. I can't be doing any of that.
Okay.
I really can't. I mean, I have a big row with certain American actors who want to have a religious experience every time they act. And I really don't want to go down that road. I believe the best actors are children. Children are the best actors. I once did a video, you can get it on YouTube. It's called Brian Cox's Masterclass with Theo, who's a 2-year-old boy. And I taught him to be or not to be. Now, he got distracted. He went everywhere. But he did things which were his own. He didn't do research, you know. He didn't research the part. He didn't do any of the nonsense that we think about. He just did it. And he did it in the most extraordinary way. And then there's a moment in it when he does the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And he did something which I didn't tell him to do. He just went, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. and it meant so much. But it was him. It was totally who he was, you know.
That's fantastic.
Let's hear now from Sam Bennett. Where are you, Sam? Oh, there you are.
In light of many recent controversies and revelations of artists across many disciplines, can you separate the art from the artist?
Brian, you had quite a few things to say about some people that you've performed with over the years in your biography that might have got you into a little bit of trouble. But can you separate the art from the artist, particularly when the artist may be in many ways repugnant?
Well, you have to have it's a discipline. You know, art and artistry is a discipline. It's always a discipline. And I've played a lot of really not very nice people. And you have to learn how to do that. And you have to learn, and you have to keep a sense of distance. That's why I don't it's pretend. That's why I always go back to the child. And I say this to when I've taught, I always remind students that they should always have a picture of themselves as a little boy or a little girl, just to remind them that that's who they are. Because fundamentally, that's who we all are. I mean, we get as we get older, you know, this whole carapace becomes something else. But the little boy and the little girl still dwells in us all. And it's that little boy and little girl that has to be absolutely honoured all the time.
I have to ask you, Brian, I mean, there are many here that you spoke about, but is Johnny Depp still overblown and overrated?
I never said he was overblown. I never said he was overblown. I did say he was overrated. That's a personal opinion. But do you know something? I think that Johnny Depp also thinks he's overrated.
But Marlon, when it comes to artists, if it comes to someone like Michael Jackson, of course, allegations have been made against Kevin Spacey, of course, that we've seen going through his own trials as well. Does it make us, and there have been others throughout history, but does it make us look at the artist differently or the art differently because of the artist? How do you approach that?
Well, clearly it does, but it doesn't
But you can
always.
still listen or watch?
I mean, I think everyone, and it's good that it's this way, everyone should have their own relationship with the artist and their art, you know, and everyone has to make their own decision. And if if it feels wrong because they can't escape something about that person that's made that, then don't watch it, don't listen to it. It's not, no one's compelled to do anything.
Absolutely.
But obviously time is a big factor. You know, we don't really know much about Shakespeare. Shakespeare's
Brian
life,
might.
but you know, I don't know enough to cancel Shakespeare. You know, and too much time has elapsed to bother. So you know, and of course this is such a intensely visible and interpenetrative society. So these questions are far more prescient than they've ever been. So yeah, it's a very hot potato.
It is indeed. To cap off tonight's discussion, a question from Jonathan Moen.
G'day, I just want to say happy 95th to my grandmother.
Yay!
Happy birthday, Grandma.
But my question tonight is for Marlon. I think the new recording is wonderful, and yeah. Your mix of traditional culture with contemporary sounds is great. I wondered if you could talk to us about the struggles of marrying those two elements of traditional and contemporary, and yeah, maybe some triumphs as well.
You're also going to, you've written songs, or you're going to be recording songs in Māori as well.
Yeah. So I'm allowing it and embracing it more and more and being more confident with that. But as I've already said tonight, I'm a very I follow my nose with that kind of stuff, and the marriage is always easy if you follow your nose. You know, it's it was never having some Māori words. I mean, only on this album there's just a few Māori words scattered throughout it, and if I take a post hoc look at it, I'd say that I'm trying to make it sort of slip in. I'm just trying to Trojan horse Māori into the world at large, but it didn't feel like that going into it. Maybe I'm thinking in Māori more or whatever, but it felt very natural for it to come out that way, and it's it's a delight now to have people come up and ask about what's going on there, because I forget that it's that I'm singing in Māori, and it's like, what does that mean? It's like, oh right, yeah. So yeah, it's 360 degrees. It's a really wonderful process but it is a very natural one for me, and I'm very happy to be at the spot, and so I just will continue going further and further into that, and I can't help but bring the modern world or my world, that they're always forever married, yeah.
And we're in for a treat because Marlon's going to sing us out as well. It might be your cue, Marlon. That's all we have time for tonight. Thanks to our panel, Brian Cox, Deborah Cheetham, Marlon Williams, Catherine McGregor and Andrew Quilty. Marlon? Marlon's just grabbing a quick glass of water before he has to perform. Thanks to those of you here and at home for driving the conversation and streaming us on iView. Now, next week we'll be live in Sydney. Joining me to answer your questions, Ruth Ben-Geert, Kevin Roos, Michelle Rowland, Sisonke Msimang and Dave Sharma. Please head to our website and you can register to be in the audience. The details are there on your screen, so please get involved. Now, as I said, something pretty special to close the show. A live performance from Marlon Williams with Thinking of Nina from his new album, My Boy.
Does she love me? Real trust is thin on the ground. Would she tell me? Or would that be breaking promises to somebody else? Please don't mistake my intentions. I believe in love under certain conditions. But tonight I'm thinking of Nina. Said she'd meet me down at the station, 9:45. Misconnection. Now I don't think I'll ever see her again. Don't take offense at the notion. I believe in love. I just have my suspicions. Oh no. So tonight I'm thinking of Nina. It must be scary, just making out like you got skin in the game. Trouble, trouble, when you're playing with hearts, you're playing with shame. Ooh, wish she could give me a reason, but more than that, I believe in love. I believe in love. Wish I could give her freedom. Ooh, but I believe in love. But I believe in love. And it's not my place, it's not my place to say it. Ooh, but you're in trouble